There is a shelf in a garage somewhere in this country, right now, holding a case of water bottles nobody has touched in 3 years. The owner feels prepared. The label still reads clearly. The plastic has not changed color. And yet almost everything about that shelf, the location, the assumption, the number of bottles, the fact that nobody has looked at it since the day it was bought, contradicts guidance that a federal agency has published in plain language on a public website for over a decade. This is not a story about secrets. Nothing here has been hidden from anyone. The Federal Emergency Management Agency publishes its recommendations openly through Ready.gov, updated, dated, and free to read by anyone with an internet connection. The problem was never access. The problem is translation. A guideline written for the broadest possible audience gets absorbed by individual households through habit, through half-memory, through what a neighbor said once at a barbecue, and by the time it settles into a family's actual pantry, it barely resembles what the agency originally said at all. 15 of those gaps are worth walking through slowly, because each one on its own sounds small enough to shrug off, and together they explain why so many homes that consider themselves prepared are quietly working from a version of the guidance that was never accurate to begin with. Ask yourself, as each one comes up, whether your own shelf would survive the comparison, or whether it is quietly resting on the same shorthand version everyone around you inherited, without ever checking the original wording. Start with water, because it is the single most repeated number in this entire category, and also, somehow, the most misunderstood. The federal guidance is 1 gallon of water per person, per day, for several days. Most people hear that number exactly once and treat it as a ceiling. A target that once reached means the job is finished. But the agency's own language calls it a baseline, not a comfortable margin. It states that a normally active adult needs close to 3/4 of a gallon just to function under ordinary conditions, and then adds, almost as an aside easy to miss on a first read, that children, nursing mothers, people who are already ill, and anyone living through a hot climate will need more than that. That single word, more, rarely survives the trip from the government document into the household version of the rule. The 1 gallon number survives intact. The adjustment clause quietly disappears somewhere along the way. The second gap sits right next to it, and it concerns time rather than quantity. Ready.gov frames 3 days as the floor, the bare minimum intended for a short-term disruption, a power outage or a bad storm that passes quickly, while pointing toward 2 weeks as the actual planning target for anything more serious than that. Somewhere between the agency's published document and the family's shopping list, that 2-week recommendation gets dropped entirely, and the 3-day minimum quietly becomes the whole plan. Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria is the example that keeps resurfacing in emergency management literature, where entire regions of the island went without reliable running water for months, not days, and where households that had planned carefully for a long weekend without power found themselves facing a disruption measured in seasons instead. A 3-day supply, built for a 3-day event, is a plan for the wrong disaster, sized for an emergency that ends long before the real one does, and there is rarely a warning bell that rings on day 4 to say the plan has quietly run out of runway. Third is a habit almost everyone carries without ever noticing it, and it involves nothing more dramatic than the date printed on a package. The United States Department of Agriculture states plainly that most shelf-stable foods remain entirely safe to eat well beyond that printed date, and that phrases like "best by describe" peak quality, not the exact moment food turns dangerous. Families routinely discard perfectly good canned goods the week that date passes, quietly assuming safety and freshness are the same measurement. They are not the same thing at all. The agency's own guidance is that a can in good physical condition, still properly sealed, can remain completely safe long after the quality window has technically closed, even if the texture or flavor has started to drift. Fourth, and this is where things get more specific than most people expect walking in, is the question of dented cans. The instinct runs in one of 2 directions: either throw away anything with a mark on it, or keep anything that still looks roughly like a can from a distance. Both instincts miss the actual rule entirely. Food safety guidance from the Food Safety and Inspection Service draws a real, testable line here. A shallow dent on the flat side of a can is typically not a safety concern at all. A dent that sits directly on a seam, or one deep enough that a finger settles into it comfortably, is a fundamentally different situation, because that kind of damage can compromise the seal that keeps oxygen and bacteria locked out. That distinction, shallow versus seam, cosmetic versus structural, is the actual difference between food that is completely fine and food that carries a real risk of botulism, a toxin produced by bacteria that thrive specifically in the sealed, oxygen-free environment AA can is designed to create. Fifth is where the stockpile actually lives, physically, inside the home. And this one is almost entirely about geography. Garages and attics are the most common storage locations people choose, mostly because they offer space nobody else in the household wants to fight over. But federal food safety guidance is explicit that temperatures above roughly 32 degrees Celsius accelerate the breakdown of canned goods, affecting both texture and long-term safety in ways that compound the longer the exposure lasts. A garage in summer, across most of this country, regularly exceeds that number for weeks at a stretch, sometimes months in warmer climates. The exact same cans, purchased on the exact same day from the exact same store, stored instead in a closet inside a temperature-controlled home, would last measurably longer than those baking quietly above a parked car all July and August. Sixth is rotation, and the guidance itself is not complicated in the slightest. Check the pantry every few weeks. Use what has been sitting there longest. Replace what gets used along the way. What happens in practice looks nothing like that. It is closer to a single purchase followed by years of total silence. The shelf gets filled once, usually during a brief moment of motivation after watching the news, and then quietly becomes furniture. Nobody touches it again until an actual emergency forces the question, at which point the household discovers, all at once and usually at the worst possible time, exactly how much of that stock quietly expired in both the harmless quality sense and, in a smaller number of unlucky cases, the genuinely unsafe sense. There is a quiet psychological cost to this too, separate from the food itself. Opening a supposedly ready shelf during an actual emergency and finding half of it unusable does more than waste a shopping trip. It chips away at the exact sense of calm and control the shelf was supposed to provide in the first place, right at the moment that sense of control matters most. If you are the kind of person who likes catching a gap before it becomes a real problem instead of after, this next point tends to be the one that changes how people think about the entire shelf. Subscribing means you see the rest of these before an actual situation makes them urgent instead of simply interesting. Seventh is calorie planning, and this is where a lot of quietly outdated math tends to live undisturbed. Emergency planning references generally point toward roughly 2,000 calories per adult per day as a baseline figure, borrowed largely from ordinary nutritional guidance built for ordinary days. But multiple sources on disaster nutrition note something that baseline number does not account for. People under acute stress, dealing with physical labor, disrupted sleep, and constant background anxiety tend to eat noticeably more than usual, with estimates running 20 to 30% above normal daily intake. There is a human dimension underneath that number worth sitting with for a moment. Stress does not only raise hunger, it also narrows patience, and food that is bland, repetitive, or unfamiliar becomes harder to tolerate exactly when morale is already thin. A stockpile calculated purely on ordinary daily needs, with zero variation in flavor or texture, can run short on both calories and goodwill precisely during the stretch when a household is working hardest, sleeping least, and most in need of something that still tastes like a choice rather than a ration. Eighth is a narrower version of the water mistake, and it concerns what water actually gets counted in the first place. The federal list is explicit that water needs include sanitation, not drinking alone. Cooking, basic hygiene, and yes, pets all draw from that same limited supply whether a household planned for it or not. Most home calculations count only the bottles meant for drinking, and stop there, quietly assuming the sink will keep working for everything else. During an actual extended outage, it usually does not, and that gap surfaces exactly when there is no easy way to close it. Ninth is one of those items that sounds almost too small to matter, until the actual night it happens is pictured clearly. A can that has frozen, left sitting in an unheated space during a cold snap, can swell for two very different reasons that look identical from the outside. Sometimes it is simply the physical expansion of the contents as they freeze, harmless on its own. Sometimes that same swelling is a sign that Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria responsible for botulism, has already begun producing its toxin inside the sealed can. Food safety guidance is blunt about the correct response here. A swollen can gets discarded regardless of which explanation seems more likely in the moment, because there is genuinely no reliable way to tell the difference by looking, and guessing wrong carries a real and serious health cost. This is one of those rare cases in emergency planning where curiosity is not worth the risk, and where the safest move looks, from the outside, almost identical to simple wastefulness. 10th is the manual can opener, and it belongs in the category of details so simple they get overlooked precisely because they seem far too basic to ever forget. It appears explicitly, by name, on the federal supply list. It is also, according to disaster preparedness volunteers and emergency responders who bring this up constantly, one of the single most common items missing from home kits, for the entirely predictable reason that an electric opener becomes useless the exact moment the power that runs it disappears. 11th is medication, specifically the non-prescription kind that rarely gets treated as part of emergency planning at all. Pain relievers, anti-diarrheal medication, antacids. These are named directly, by category, in the federal supply checklist, sitting right alongside flashlights and batteries as equally official items. Households tend to stock the more dramatic entries with real enthusiasm. The flashlight, the radio, the fire extinguisher, while treating the medicine cabinet as something separate from emergency planning entirely, a category that exists on its own and therefore never gets checked against the same list everything else came from. 12th circles back to the 3-day number from earlier, because it deserves a second look from a different angle. Analyses of household preparedness have found that the average American home holds something close to 3.7 days of food on hand at any given moment, a number that lines up almost exactly with the federal minimum rather than the federal target. That alignment is not really a coincidence. It is the minimum quietly becoming the goal, the floor becoming the ceiling, which means an enormous number of households are, without ever realizing it, planning for the shortest possible version of a disaster instead of a realistic one. 13th, and this is the one that tends to surprise people every single time it comes up, involves the exact water sitting in that garage from the opening of this video. Properly treated tap water, sealed inside a clean, food-grade container, does not spoil the way most people quietly assume it does. It does not need to be thrown out on a fixed schedule the way milk does. What actually happens over time is a slow loss of taste, a flatness, sometimes a faint plastic note picked up from the container itself, which is why guidance suggests rotating stored water roughly every 6 to 12 months, not because it becomes dangerous at that point, but because it becomes unpleasant to drink. Confusing those two very different things leads to two opposite mistakes, either throwing away water that was still completely safe, or assuming that safety extends indefinitely when what actually changes first is nothing more serious than flavor. 14th is a phrase repeated across preparedness circles, so often it starts to sound like an official federal rule, even though it really functions more as a rough biological outline than an actual safety target. 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, 3 months without community. A shorthand meant to describe how quickly different kinds of deprivation turn dangerous, in general and in sequence. Treating that phrase as a comfortable planning goal, rather than the extreme outer limit it was always meant to describe, is exactly how minimums quietly turn into entire plans. 15th, and this is the one that ties every earlier point together instead of introducing something new. None of these 14 gaps trace back to bad guidance from the agency itself. Every single one of them comes from good, carefully written guidance that got compressed, simplified, and passed along informally until the nuance fell away, and only the headline number survived intact. The agency said 1 gallon and meant it as a floor. It said 3 days and meant it as a bare minimum. It said check the label and meant quality, not danger. The information was never actually missing from public view. The context sitting around it was. None of this is medical advice, and none of it was ever meant to replace an actual conversation with a doctor, a pharmacist, or a local emergency management office, particularly around medication, specific health conditions, or the needs of infants, elderly family members, or anyone managing a chronic illness day to day. What sits in this video is context, publicly available and freely checkable by anyone who wants to look, laid out the way it was originally written rather than the way it usually gets passed down secondhand. What a household chooses to do with that context, and how far past the floor they decide to plan, is a decision that belongs entirely to the people actually living in that house, ideally made with clearer eyes than most stockpiles ever get built with. That shelf in the garage from the very beginning is not wrong, because someone was careless, or lazy, or uninformed in any way that reflects badly on them. It is exactly what happens when a genuinely good piece of public guidance gets absorbed through habit and hallway conversation, instead of through the original document sitting quietly online the whole time. The fix was never a secret list of better products, or a more expensive kit, or a bunker in the backyard. It was simply rereading the 15 lines that were already sitting in plain view the entire time, written for exactly this kind of household, waiting to be read the way they were actually meant, not the way they got passed down through habit until only the headline number was left standing.